Our next panel is going to do a deeper dive into some of the marine ecosystem changes, some of which we already heard about. And obviously it's a change, we've already heard a lot about how rapidly things are changing. So we're going from an ice-covered ocean into something that's much more accessible to commercial activities, and with it increased vulnerabilities and variability. So we want to talk about the social and ecological implications that come from the changes of the marine ecosystem. And here to do that, we have three wonderful people from across the Arctic representing three different places and points of view. And I'd like to introduce now, we have Lene, Kielsen, Holm from the Greenland Climate Research Center. I'd like to come stage. Thank you. We have Anne Robertson from U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski's office. And we have Paul Wassmann from the Arctic University of Norway. Thank you. So Paul, I'd like to start with you. We've heard some of these changes. I wonder if you can speak specifically about the changes in the marine ecosystem. What are some of the major things we've seen, and why does it matter that we understand these?
Well, as you mentioned, there has been a lot of changes in the Arctic, in every part of the Arctic. And in the area where I work, of course, the greatest changes are the reduction in ice and arrival of new boreal species, changes in fisheries and fishery patterns, and last not least, changes in productivity. The productivity in traditional fishing areas is decreasing while it's increasing in the north. And all that has, of course, implications for the main interest in the Arctic in Norway, which is based on fisheries. If all the fish from the Barents Sea, fished by Norwegian fishermen, would go to the United States, that would be 17 fish meals per capita per year. That tells you that it is an important thing for the national economy, and it has, of course, also important ramifications for the culture and the economy at the coast, and then both Sami and Norwegian. So we pay attention to the changes, and the changes have immediately implications for how life is taking place now and towards 2050.
Thank you, Paul. So from a scientific perspective, we have made these investigations. We often study the open ocean and systems into deep waters and try to understand these connections through those studies. Lene, from a community perspective and from Greenland and other Arctic residents' perspective, where we have this strong bond to the marine environment and dependency on the marine environment, what are some of the major changes that you have experienced, that people have experienced, and what are the implications of some of those changes?
In Greenland, where I am from, we have been working with these issues, talking with people, the users of the resources in our areas for more than 15 years. Going from place to talk with people about the changes that they have observed throughout their lifetimes. And there are changes both in the ocean, both with the animals, both with the seasons, the weather, but these are environmental changes that they are talking about, but at the same time, our people are talking about other changes that will also have an impact on their livelihoods, like the global opinion on how we use the resources in our areas that have had a lot of negative impact on our livelihoods, like the seal banning policy. That's just an example, which impacted a lot of families in Greenland. But these global opinions towards our livelihoods has also risen the awareness that the Greenlandic people, the Inuit, we are not isolated in our regions. We are part of the global community. And of course we want to learn from others, but we also offer to help to gain some more knowledge by working together.
So Anne, maybe over to you. So, we hear about these changes, and you can hear some of the implications both from a kind of system science perspective and its importance because of all the interdependencies and then the implications to people. And of course, these changes are increasing ever rapidly. So from a policy perspective, how do we deal with those? Like, do we have the tools that we need, both in terms of the frameworks to address the issues and also at the pace that we may need to address them?
I'm going to answer your question kind of in reverse and talk first about some of the lessons we're learning, I think, as policymakers, as we see all these changes happening rapidly and getting faster and faster. The first thing that comes to mind for me as someone who works on marine policy, oceans, fisheries, for a lawmaker who has a hand in shaping budgets, looking at how the federal government operates in our nation's marine spaces, is how well are our systems keeping up with the pace of change in the Arctic? And the truth is that they, in many ways, are not. So we see that, Congress is not known for doing things quickly. I think we can all agree on that. But we see funding needs for science that we're scrambling to address. And the changes are happening so rapidly in places like the Northern Bering Sea that we may not be able to keep pace with what the science needs are. And it's difficult because the Arctic kind of touches every part of the federal government in different ways. The way our government is set up, it's split into agencies that have their own kind of topical focus. And as a result, what I think the tools we need to put in place that we kind of have but could be doing a better job of using are making sure that there's really strong coordination and discussion happening across the federal government from all agencies that are operating or affecting some way issues that are relevant in the Arctic as we see rapid change there. So some of those convening spaces already exist. The U.S. Arctic Research Commission is one that kind of sets the science policy goals for the United States, and then the Interagency Arctic Research and Policy Committee, housed over at NSF, kind of works on implementation, making sure those priorities are translating to the ground. But at a higher level on federal policy as it applies to strategic interests, the security of communities in the Arctic, the security of communities outside the Arctic that are maybe affected by the Arctic, that coordination, I think, can be strengthened. And that's an effort that I've been focused on in my work as a policy staffer on Capitol Hill. So.
Thank you. And so while I maybe get a tablet so I can see the questions from the audience, let's follow up on some of the points that were discussed both earlier today and yesterday, and some of you mentioned them. So it has to do with collaboration and cooperation, right? And we hear about these at all different levels, right? There's challenges within or needs within the different departments, say within different governments, right? Or certainly and across governments, if we think about that. There are different ways that communities collaborate, both within a nation or geography, and try to do this on a broader scale. And there's lots of really positive initiatives as well amongst scientists and figuring out, hey, we need to collaborate across disciplines as well. Okay, so those exist, and we have examples for those. I was wondering maybe through each of you, through your three different lenses that you think about, do you have good examples where either between the groups you represent, two or maybe all three of them, there has been good ways forward, and said we have worked together with this other group really well to help, for example, decision making. You know, we have worked really well with the community to address this problem more holistically. So I'd like this point of view from all three of you, if you have a good example, and if you do, would you be able to extract some nuggets out of those? Like what made that actually work so that we can, and it doesn't matter where this was, can we have what we learned from those that we can apply perhaps to other places? So maybe I'll start with you, Lene.
Yeah, yesterday we were, somebody was saying that we have more questions than answers in regards to the Arctic region in connection with what science is contributing to the understanding of what is happening in the Arctic. But I think that working together, all of us hopefully will pose the right questions, more questions that are of importance also to the Arctic people, which has not been the case for many years. One work we did and is called Psycho-Inuitida, which means the sea ice, the people, and the weather, the universe. And from that work, which was interdisciplinary but also transdisciplinary in its how we worked together, it was international. We had hunters and fishermen from both Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, and researchers like myself, anthropologists, but also physical scientists working together to understand the life in connection with sea ice, the changing sea ice. And I think that was a very good way of working together. We even retranslated a book we did, The Meaning of Ice, into the 3 different dialects, Inuktitut, Inupiatut, and Karatsut, because we want to what we learned from this to be understood also at home, that this is not only for the information of outsiders, but within our own communities.
And yeah.
I think that, excuse me, we see collaboration within government, but also outside of it. I think in Alaska there are some really excellent examples of Indigenous knowledge, local communities on the ground in rural parts of the Arctic, on the coastlines, working closely with scientists to provide the information that's needed to inform the people back here in DC about what's going on. Those examples, I think, have been limited. There's more that needs to happen to really entrench that and make sure that those conversations are happening consistently. So developing stronger channels between communities and policymakers here in Washington, D.C., who are either setting research priorities or, you know, once science has been gathered, information has been gathered, using that to make a decision. I think something that we're focused on in Senator Murkowski's office, and she's introduced legislation to this effect, is how can we institutionalize, the same way I was talking about some of the collaborative spaces within government, but how do we build ways for those conversations to happen outside of just the federal government and with the communities on the ground that are being affected by Arctic change? So Senator Murkowski's introduced a bill called the Arctic Policy Act. It would update the Arctic Research and Policy Act, which originally set up the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, for example. And what that bill would do is it would make permanent in statute the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, this group of the deputy level agency, high level leadership to make sure those conversations are happening across government. But it would also set up, starting off, a Bering Sea Tribal Advisory Group, a group of tribally elected officials from the Bering Sea region, Bering Straits region, to convene and cooperate with the Arctic Executive Steering Committee to make sure that information, that dialogue is taking place and that those relationships are being developed. I think, I'll try to be mindful of the time here, I think back to the word cloud that I think David put up on the screen earlier about how, and he was talking specifically about adaptation, but efforts can be very diffuse across the federal government, and for policymakers who have an oversight role and a funding role, like we do in Congress, I think we're trying to think creatively about building systems that really allow for the information exchange and the collaboration that needs to take place. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Paul, for you, I'd like to combine that question I just posed with a question that came from the audience. So there is lots of great examples about scientific collaboration, right? We've heard about, and you know, so in the Pacific side of the Arctic, there's the Distributed Biological Observatory, for example. There's the Pacific Arctic Group. There's lots of national, international collaborations that have been very successful. And you have been very instrumental with the Nansen Legacy Project, which brings also in kind of policy and has been we went beyond just the scientists, right? So can you speak about that example or perhaps other examples? And then given the scope of the changes and the kind of the need for the system understanding, there's a question here that relates to this and is wondering whether you think that marine scientists need to be educated in a somewhat different way to be able to respond to these changes which are different from the ones we've seen in the past.
There's a lot of things I should take in one go.
No pressure.
To start with the last point, I think there's a lot of people which should have a different type of education. It's not only facing the scientists, but with regard to the type of Arctic which I'm facing in the Eurasian sector of the Arctic, where fisheries are an important thing, I think there's a good cooperation understanding between science and management. And that is reflected in the way concessions to fish or permissions to fish are given, and that is reflected in the good cooperation, bilateral cooperation Norway has with Russia. And I think the sustainability or the level of fishing on fish stocks, on marine mammals, etc., they talk for themselves, that there is a good management regime. And it's based on the understanding that we are dealing with ecosystems, so we need a systemic approach, and that all the systemic data are on the table when, for example, in the Nansen Legacy, decisions have to be made in the hitherto ice-covered areas, which will get accessible for economic activities in the future. Because the Norwegian Parliament or the public could demand for a sustainability report before a permission is given. And for that, you need that type of and I think in Norway we have been quite successful to do basic science, which then immediately serves the need for the politician and managers to do their job. And then you have to remind me on some of the points I should also ask.
No, that's okay. I think you addressed some of the main issues about collaboration, in this case between the policy and the scientists working together on these larger scales. Yeah.
But there's one point I would like to make. When it comes to cooperation, we need far more international cooperation across the Arctic, because we have all our understanding from where in the Arctic we are, But the Arctic is a circular system. It's a Mediterranean type ocean, and Mediterra means in the middle of the Earth. So there's a lot of Earth around the Arctic Ocean. And the scientists, in principle, are ready to go to make to develop a pan-Arctic view, so that we can look at the Arctic as one through the various eyes which have on Earth. That is something which is lacking, and that creates difficulties also to understand our own house garden. So Pan-Arctic integration and circumpolar cooperation, at least on the scientific level, which should be easy to go because there is not so much politics involved or UNCLOS or this type of things. So that is something I would really like to see in the future.
Well, let's talk a lot about this some more. And there's a couple of questions that sort of go around this issue of this more holistic view. So we've heard a lot from the Arctic residents and through the Inuit Circumpolar Council. There is already a big effort to kind of think about, and naturally think about this on a broader scale, and not think about the geopolitical modern divisions that we have. From a scientific perspective, there is, the funding streams and how it goes there, and scientists are good and creative of how to kind of figure out and working together across some of those boundaries as well. And then, so there is good, positive things towards that. From a policy intergovernmental perspective, we use the ministerial, the Arctic Council, and a few other vehicles like that. So your point, Paul, was that there's more there, and we have this information. From a coastal residents perspective, you are trying to bridge those gaps as well and bring those together. So how can both of those things merge with the policy needs and creating that collaboration on another level when it comes to, yes, this is one system. We understand. People have understood this for a long, long time. Scientists are trying to create this conceptual model of a combined Arctic. How do we bring those together? And then how do we bring those together if we're going to have to create policies or govern in a one way when we know these systems are interconnected? So it's an open-ended question, but be curious to hear your thoughts from your different points of view. Paul is making a point from more is needed there. So what would that be? Maybe that's to all of you.
I think a place that we can start is simply by sitting down and thinking strategically about where can we make progress on collaboration and science. There's a strong history of collaboration across Arctic nations and non-Arctic nations to further our understanding of the Arctic Ocean and that kind of larger polar system. But outside of just the scientific work, I think that we can be doing more as policymakers to sit down and scratch our heads and say, well, what lessons could we be sharing across national boundaries, across, over the poles? What lessons can we be learning about? I hear so much emphasis put on developing a blue economy in the United States these days, developing sustainably managed fisheries, building strong coastal livelihoods, and that is work that's very much been progressing for many years in places like Iceland and Norway. So are there lessons that we can be talking about and learning together on topics that aren't strung up in those political kind of obstacles? I think that topics like strengthening collaboration with communities, we can probably learn a lot from each other, and also starting to talk about resilience and how we adapt. I think that the more knowledge that we put towards those discussions, from not just here in the United States but elsewhere, the better.
Lene?
Maybe we should start thinking about shifting the paradigms that are putting the way we are doing science today, putting the framework for how we do science. But at the same time, it can't be done within the science itself, because the funding agencies and those who are funding science, they are also putting some frames that the scientists should work within. And maybe a future conference could try to solve this thing, to bring different ways of knowing closer together, to get some more, better results that are benefiting not only the scientific community, but also the people of the Arctic, but also at global level.
Thank you. I know Brendan is taking notes. That'll be the next conference he's going to organize. There's a question here. It relates to a comment that was made earlier, very powerfully so, in the last panel about youth and the role of youth. So this is a question to you, Anne, about what's your point of view or your vision for having youth become policymakers, or is that something you would recommend, perhaps? Or how do you see or do you see a way for closer involvement for youth in that process?
Absolutely. I think that there are not enough Alaskans, not enough Indigenous Alaskans working in Washington, D.C., working on policy kind of close to the source here, where all the discussions take place, where we hear it as members of Alaska's congressional delegation, of the frustration about, a lot of the discussions that take place in DC affect us back in Alaska, and that's a challenge that needs to be overcome. But I do think that there are incredible opportunities, going back to kind of how science is happening in the Arctic and in Arctic communities, participatory science, science that is being led by communities to address issues that are relevant, and with support from agencies who are able to put resources towards that I see as a really incredible opportunity for young people to get involved. And there are like weird barriers sometimes in the federal government about hiring interns and who can work where, and it gets down to a very detailed level. But if we can focus on looking for those obstacles and finding ways to get young people involved, especially Indigenous young people from Arctic communities that are experiencing change, that I think will ultimately create a strong pipeline to get scientists from Alaska, Indigenous scientists, policymakers, to start building a greater presence here in Washington, because I'm always so happy to hear when a new person from Alaska comes to town to work here, but there needs to be more of that. So any opportunity for us as policymakers to make it easier for young people to get involved in research that's happening in a community, to get involved in policy discussions that are taking place in communities or back here in DC, I think I welcome those opportunities and would love to keep focusing on that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we have actually a whole bunch of ambassadors from Students on Ice here, and so perhaps we'll have Students on the Hill, initiative or something.
We had a chance to meet with them earlier, so.
We often hear about when policy decisions have to be made or need to be made about using the best available science. And as scientists, we're often really worried, and we heard about this already in past conversations about, we can say a lot of things. We have a lot of knowledge about these systems, but like everything else, we can't give you 100%. That's just not possible. So we provide information in ranges and other things, right? So the questions relate sort of to that and says, we are seeing disasters and hazards on the ground which are affecting lives. And why is the concern with best available science in order to make policy when we see the trends in action? And relates to we'll see later on today, the tabletop exercise of perhaps how that information kind of flows in. But if people are seeing these strong changes and they're affecting people's livelihoods in communities, why is the default, I think I'm interpreting the question here, why is the default going back to, well, we can't do this unless we have the best available science to make the decision? How do we deal with this dichotomy? Because we want to we need to respond if it's an emergency, and we want to respond like immediately, and we want to respond in a more systemic way if it's a problem that may last, and we may need more information for that. But if people on the land are seeing those, how do we marry those two together, both from integrating the scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge as well as from a policy reaction point of view?
I think that the doubt, which is a core in science, you have to doubt your results in order to make progress. That core is very greatly misused in politics. And that makes that we come into, so to say, in dire straits. We have to keep to the core of the science, the doubt. It has to be better. Is it true like that? And then the decision maker said, oh, we need more, maybe it's not right, and we need more research. But obvious things which we can have some doubt on are good enough to make decisions here and now. And I feel very often unhappy about that.
And from your perspective, what do you think?
I think it's a tricky question for sure, and I recognize exactly what Paul's saying about how doubt can be used to delay or promote skepticism, obviously. I do think that it's the way government is set up, the kind of systemic processes that we use to develop policy, iterate policy, figure out, what the appropriate solution is, evaluate alternatives. For policymakers, I think that there isn't always really an understanding of what uncertainty means in a scientific context, that it's something that can be quantified in a statistical analysis, a coefficient of variation, whatever. I think that message isn't always translating over to the people who are just sitting scratching their heads at a proposal saying, well, if we do this, this could happen. It's likely that it won't to this degree, but that doesn't always make sense to people who have law degrees or public policy degrees. So I think what that speaks to is the need for policymakers to talk to scientists more, which is exactly what this convening is meant to do, simply so that certainty or uncertainty can be contextualized a bit, and perhaps put in perspective in a way that policymakers can understand. What does it truly mean when there is not a 100% positive answer, negative answer? This came up in the last panel.
But what about the flip side of that? So if from a scientific perspective, we haven't had a chance to study this well enough perhaps, or perhaps it's an issue that hasn't been addressed at all, or we can't tell for certain, it's like, well, I don't know if this is going to happen again next year. But the people on the ground are telling us, well, we're seeing this change. Like, scientists haven't been here because they're not everywhere. Can we do something anyway? So how do you deal with that? So you only have, perhaps you would like to have both the local knowledge or the regional knowledge as well as the scientific knowledge to integrate. But when you only have, and there's good examples of when you only have the scientific knowledge, right? Because that's we're kind of used to have that information pipeline. What if we only have this other side? How do we deal with that then? Is that sufficient? I guess that's really the question. How can we make that as valuable so that there's this pipeline that's open from that type of information just as it is perhaps from the scientific side?
I think it's sufficient to get the ball rolling for policymakers to at least start, looking at solutions and talking about those. And the challenge of, like I spoke to at the beginning of the panel, of obstacles in government that preclude kind of that response and that adaptive capacity to react to the risks and new challenges as they arise. A case in point that I think of is the changes that we're seeing in the northern Bering Sea. The cold pool has diminished or practically gone away for 2 years now, I think, and we are struggling to get money, sufficient money, to NOAA so that they can do the science in the northern Bering Sea to understand where fish are going, what the changes are happening. And it's incredibly frustrating to be pointing that out and then running up against challenges in the funding process. So I think that the information that we're getting from communities on the ground, Indigenous subsistence users who are identifying changes, that absolutely can kick off the process here of figuring out clearly what the problem is, what the drivers are, and what possible solutions are. But I think that we also need to be resourcing federal scientists as well to then go and work with those communities to learn more. I don't think that we can ever have too much information, but I do see how that creates, like Paul noted, the risk of people saying, well, we don't have enough information yet. So yeah, it puts policymakers and I think the people feeling the changes on the ground in a tough position, but I think that with more communication and more of that kind of collaborative work, we can at least start the process of policymaking to address that.
Lene, I imagine you have an opinion on this matter.
Of course, I think it's about time that we skip the skepticism towards the indigenous people's knowledge, and because to my understanding and the way I see our knowledge that has been gained for many, many years, for millennia from the area, we need to have more, to be more open to other ways of knowing, because the people who are living there, they are observing their environment year round, while to our experience, a lot of scientists are only coming for a very limited time of the year, and they will have to gather all that information through many years to analyze them, and afterwards they will have a result, hopefully. But the people who are living there, if we give them more trust or trust them more, that will be to the benefit to not only to the people who are living there, but also to the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you. There's a series of, I mean, there's lots of great, fantastic questions. There's a couple questions that relate to capacity building. And so we hear often about where there's an institutional capacity that's needed. And I know somebody said yesterday, I don't want more government agencies or institutions. But at the same time, I know, Lene, you have spoken about ways that information could come together, and we heard it yesterday. Gunn-Britt talked about as well about indigenous organizations that may exist or we may expand on. So there's enough capacity to actually do all this. We're talking a lot about communication. Everybody should be talking to each other. Information needs to be treated respectfully. Do we have enough capacity at that level? What may that look like? And then on the from the both scientific and indigenous community perspective, but also from a management and policy perspective, do we have actually have the capacity to adapt and respond in the right way, right? And so, and then I'll get back to that. I'll let you think on that, Anne. I'll get back to this because I'd like to spend a little bit of time that we have left on that. So let's talk a little bit about capacity building and the need for that. And I think there's been a lot of really positive trends towards that, but I'm not sure it has addressed quite all the needs that we have. Would you like to have Lene?
I think capacity building should go both ways, or multiple ways, because that will be the most respectful way of doing it. We have to teach our children about the outside world of our community, but we have also to teach the outside community about our world. And only in this way the communication between different ways of understanding our being in the universe will bring us closer together. We can't do that by always having these very different ways of understanding ourselves separately. We have to try to bring different ways of knowing together by communicating these entities. But communication is not always easy, especially with indigenous peoples that have their own languages, many of us. In Greenland, we have Garalsut, and then Danish, and then English is coming afterwards. So the information, we can't extract that directly from the internet, for instance, or from journals. We need help to get to be able to learn from it. So, yeah.
Paul?
In addition to the valuable point Lene is doing, there's also a lot of capacity which is not used in our nations, because ministers and institutes and very much capacity is enshrined in formalized structures which are not often used to the very best for the nation. So on the structural level, how to combine institutions, so to answer the grand question which a nation has, a lot of formal things could be done to improve that.
Okay, so and I want to make a short plug, and I'd like to get to the adaptive management question here towards the end. But we've heard a lot about communication and the need for communication, and often there's like, oh, we could do more communicated, we could better. As somebody who spent a lot of time doing science communication, I will say that there's a lot of excellent scientists. They're in this room, many of them are in this room, which are fantastic communicators. And they actually spend a lot of time going to communities when they're coming in an outreach. So I'm sure more could be done, but just say there's lots of wonderful examples, and those should be acknowledged at the same time. Okay, so very, very quickly, Anne, the question of adaptive management is not what we hear about, and it's often the solution to these quickly evolving issues and problems that we have, because it needs to be less static. There are mechanisms, for example, in fishery, through the Fishery Management Council, we were at ICES yesterday, where there's these cycles of how information gets integrated and then adapted from year to year, or from maybe every 6 years or so. So there are, however, and it's been good in new ways of thinking, that adaptive system needs to be much broader, but it needs to have adaptive policies. It needs to have a lot of more adaptive things. So is that a reality, really? Is this a theoretical construct that we like, or in the reality of policy, do you think that creating more adaptive mechanisms is possible? What might they look like, if it is possible?
I think the biggest change or progress that could be made to improve adaptive management capacity at the very beginning of the process of resource management would just be looking closely at how we fund science and how we fund science. I go back to the example of the Bering Sea, Northern Bering Sea, and how we're struggling to get survey funding up there while it's like one of the most changing marine ecosystems in the world, probably. So figuring out how we can build flexibility into these just like very basic systems of like getting money to an agency, or transmitting priorities from leadership at an agency that conducts science down through to the scientists. But I also think that what keeps coming back to my mind is that to build that adaptive capacity in high levels of government here in Washington, D.C., it really requires more education and communication about the importance of the Arctic, the importance of addressing the changes that we're seeing up there. And that is a battle that I think we're certainly fighting every day in the Alaska delegation of explaining to high-level officials why the Arctic is important. And that's something that I know many of you here are involved in, or I hope you become involved in, is talking to people who have kind of a nexus to the Arctic, but maybe aren't as aware of its importance as they could be. So I'll conclude on saying we all know that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, but what happens in the Arctic also shouldn't stay in the Arctic. It needs to be communicated out to Washington, D.C., to every high-level cabinet secretary. I mean, any opportunity there is to expand and inform more decision makers about why this region is important, I think we need to take those opportunities, and that's how we can really build the capacity to be flexible.
Thank you, and I imagine the same applies to many other governments as well, not just the U.S. government, right, where those are needed. So unfortunately, we're out of time. It's a good point to end on about that these communications need to continue. There's lots of other really excellent questions that you've had, and please find the panel members and continue the discussion. It's all about starting the conversations and continue discussions. So I'm going to make a few points about lunch before I let you go. But please help me thank the panels for their insights. Thank you so much.